Welcome students to lecture 4 of MHHS 1. The last lecture focused on how an understanding of neurobiology and medical science helped the narrator move out of the reptilian couch potato zone of merely witnessing unmourned death and suffering into something who can fathom active protest and realize the benefit of solidarity and social interaction. The plot of the comic is very much about that realization after having her eyes shaken open by the film The Pianist and again by the documentary The Dignity of the Nobodies. But there's another story that emerges in the paratextual apparatus of the comic. In the endnotes and in the bibliography, we see a kind of pushback against the dominant protocols of medical institutions. In addition to the narrator's gradual education in neurobiology, the comic is also about how a more humanistic approach can challenge the imperious organizing principles of what Foucault has called the clinical gaze, and see the previous lectures for a review on that. In other words, even as we're learning with the narrator from medical science, Pichon-Rivière encourages us to question and challenge it. Hopefully by now we've learned about the historical harm of medical institutions. Go back to lecture 1 for some quick examples about that. So we know why it's dangerous to accept uncritically the conclusions of modern medical science. What Pichon-Rivière is teaching us to do is to mount that challenge thoughtfully from a rigorous humanistic perspective, rather than veering into just unhinged science denialism and conspiracy theory. And the comic gives us 3 concrete examples of how this happens. Number 1, Stephen Porges's polyvagal theory. Number 2, Shelley Taylor's tend and befriend theory. And number 3, Peter Levine's importation of ideas from indigenous healing practices. This lecture will explain how Pichon-Rivière's comic reveals the humanity-centered perspectives of these 3 neuroscientific approaches. The 3 cited authors, Porges, Taylor, and Levine, all have PhD training in neuroscience, but root their research in unconventional and sometimes even controversial methods. First, polyvagal theory emerges not from the quickly empirical or quantifiable responses to external danger, but to fuzzier, more qualitative concepts of trauma, sociality, connection, and solidarity. In Pichon-Rivière's comic, there's an oblique citation when the narrator is speaking of the unemployment crisis, of losing your job and knowing there's nothing you can do. Quote, "When our responses fail, we can regress to earlier stages of our phylogenetic history. When we are challenged, we use new circuits, and when they don't help us get into safe and appropriate situations, we regress. We use older and older circuits." So we've heard this before. We heard this in the last lecture, but we get the illustration of human phylogeny, meaning for our purposes, just the evolutionary development of us, of humanity. So there's an ancient reptilian ancestor that develops into our own mammalian phylogeny. And at the end, there's that humorous image of Homo late capitalism as a hypnotized frogman. When those newer circuits fail to get us into safety, we just fall back onto those older and older circuits to get us there, to get us to that safety. So there's no explicit explanation of polyvagal theory in the comic. So here in this lecture, I'll just give you a brief explainer. So we commonly think of our nervous system as having just 2 big parts: the central nervous system, which we call CNS, and the peripheral nervous system, which we call PNS. The CNS has the big parts that we're used to talking about, like the brain and the spinal cord. The PNS is a more diffuse network of nerves and ganglia. So we further divide the PNS into 2 more parts. One network that controls our voluntary actions, like moving our legs and our arms, and one that controls our involuntary actions, like heart rate and digestion. So the voluntary one is the somatic nervous system, and the involuntary one is the autonomic nervous system. Okay, so all of this is to say that for the purposes of explaining polyvagal theory here in this lecture, we're most interested in that autonomic nervous system, which is further divided into two other things, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous systems. The sympathetic nervous system is the one that controls the fight or flight response, whereas the parasympathetic nervous system controls the rest and digest response. All right, so that's a lot to keep track of right now, but just bear with me for a little bit. So the vagus nerve, or the 10th cranial nerve, is part of the parasympathetic nervous system. It sends signals to and from the heart, lungs, and digestive tract, regulating heart rate, breathing, and digestion. So all this is a well-established and unchallenged fact so far. What Porges theorized in 1994 is that this vagal system has at least two branches. One that supports defensive immobilization, like the reptile playing dead from the comic, and the other one that supports social engagement as a method to mitigate stress and trauma. So recall in that comic, in the comic that we read, Pichon-Rivière refers to new and old circuits that try to get us into safe and appropriate situations. The old ones are the reptilian ones, the reptilian immobilization circuits, whereas the new ones are the ones that urge us to connect with other people, to seek solidarity, to form new structures of care, and to promote social exchange. So the gap that we saw in the neuroscience of human behavior, the gap that Porges saw in the neuroscience of human behavior was about these evolutionary new humanistic exchanges that he believed to be underexplained or even unexplainable by the conventional methods and models that relied on more phylogenetically ancient behaviors like fight or flight or defensive immobilization. Those behaviors were well established as neural mechanisms by the mid-20th century. So in centering trauma and sociality as an autonomic response, he was trying to explain all of these phylogenetically new methods that our brains have developed to cope. Second, there's the citation of Shelley E. Taylor's tend and befriend theory. Quote, "It is more common for women than for men to respond to stress with a social activity of care instead of the fight or flight reaction. We, quote, tend to offspring to ensure their survival and affiliate with others for joint protection and comfort." So the social positive exchange that this impulse seeks, in turn, helps to restore the body's chemical balance. Quote, "This model may shed light on why women live longer than men." So that's all from Pichon-Riviere's comic. The gender difference being articulated here is that there might be another circuit in the brain that activates when confronted with stress. Instead of just fight or flight, there might be another circuit that responds to the social positive exchange that restores the body's chemical balance. Instead of seeking to fight or flee to resolve the stress condition of the body, humans, and again, the theory is that this is more women than men, can also seek something like, quote, the social activity of care, something that comes from tending to offspring and befriending others for joint protection and comfort. So this is perhaps an alternative neural circuit that has, for some reason, been understudied ever since fight or flight, ever since that idea of fight or flight resolving into rest and digest became such a powerful explanatory model for mammalian responses to stress. Now, it's at this point, I think it's important to point out here that everything that this and Porges's polyvagal theory are, they're understudied and perhaps not quite right. So there is the quotation at the end in a slightly bolder handwriting, quote, "This model may shed light on why women live longer than men." The may there highlights the fact that the tend and befriend theory is really a theory. There are several aspects of this theory that still need to be studied, quantified, and verified. But the point here is not the ultimate objective truth of the matter here. It's more the idea that there are a bunch of phenomena that are just left underexplained because of medical science's historically unexamined gender bias. So those of you in the sciences now will probably be familiar with these issues about gender equity in science. But for most of the history of science, women were just considered unworthy of study, while men were considered fully human, fully representative of the species. The ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle, for example, famously viewed women as defective men. In fact, he believed that women received their rational souls much later than their male counterparts, hence the idea that they're defective. And in my own personal experience, my partner is a neuroscientist who studies the mechanisms of addiction in the brain. And from him, I've learned that a lot of the animal models base their data on male mice because female mice introduce too many variables that would cost significantly more to examine. So in the current scientific models, menstrual and hormonal cycles are implicitly considered disruptions to the species norm that would just basically contaminate the data. So what I'm claiming is that this doesn't actually sound too far off from Aristotle from 2,000 years ago. Of course, apologists for these scientific methods wouldn't exactly put it this way, but perpetuating a system in which female mice models are more expensive to account for is, I think, the very definition of structural inequity. The institutional structure disincentivizes gender equity in these neuroscientific animal models. All right, so back to Taylor's tend and befriend theory. Pichon-Riviere's citation of Taylor here in this comic is meant to show that medical science is sometimes far from objective truth. Its gender-biased methods have just left a lot of data on the table. The tend and befriend theory is just the start of corrective, humanities-driven medical study. Third, we get to the citation of Peter Levine in the endnotes. In a richly illustrated panel that portrays the Incan shamanic tradition, the figure on the left sings Hampui, the Quechua invocation, come. The song is meant to invite a person, a god, a teacher, or nature to arrive at the space of healing. The panel is titled Susto, meaning a kind of emotional trauma or suffering from witnessing atrocities. And now that word is culturally specific to the indigenous peoples of Latin America, as Levine explains, quote, "The indigenous peoples throughout South America and Mesoamerica have long understood both the nature of fear and the essence of trauma. What's more, they seem to know how to transform it through their shamanic healing rituals. After colonization by the Spanish and the Portuguese, the indigenous peoples borrowed their word susto to describe what happens in trauma. Susto translates graphically as, quote, fright paralysis and as, quote, soul loss. Anyone who has suffered a trauma knows, first, paralyzing fright, followed by the bereft feeling of losing your way in the world, of being severed from your very soul." So what you hear in this passage, I think, is an outraged sense of belatedness. These things have long been understood, but according to Levine, there's been resistance to studying it and taking it seriously. Reparative work is now being done, and things are now starting to be studied empirically. On page 4 of the comic, with the image of the seated reptilian Homo late capitalism, Pichon-Rivière explains that, quote, "While the body saves energy, your soul needs to find a way out. A frozen body is no place to live." And in the endnote about Susto, there already seems to be a ready-made solution. Quote, "When a child is frightened, Susto, a shaman sings with the child's community a sweet song to call the soul back home, back to the body, back to the community." This fuzzy language of traumatic loss of pieces of the soul and calling for those pieces to come back to the self and the community, all of that can seem pseudoscientific or just plain nonsense. But as Pichon-Rivière points out, medical science is now acknowledging that there is something left unexplained about this healing practice, this indigenous healing practice. Only now are we beginning to launch studies of the, quote, melody and rhythm of singing and prosody. and how that all that supposedly fuzzy stuff elicits a, quote, calming effect on the heartbeat due to their impact on the ventral vagus nerve circuits. So again, all of this, I want to add a caveat here about Pichon-Riviere's invocation of knowing. The healing practice, quote, known for hundreds of years, and the now we know about the Hampui song, knowing is about systems of knowledge and what counts exactly as knowledge. So when we hear all of that, Pichon-Riviere's now we know, all of that is not strictly accurate within neuroscientific academic circles. It is being studied, yes, but the causal link about the ventral vagus nerve circuits is not commonly accepted. In fact, this kind of polyvagal theory is not a standard model for the autonomic nervous system. The value, I think, however, of this fuzzy knowledge is that it brings to the table things that institutional science might not conventionally acknowledge as worthy of study. All of these things that we've heard, the idea of trauma as losing pieces of the soul, all of that could sound like fictitious fancy unworthy of serious experimentation. The idea that the scientific method has a gender bias, all that could also sound impossible. After all, it is just cold, hard data. How could that possibly have a gender bias? So knowledge is strategically overstated by Pichon-Rivière throughout this comic to point out that there are different kinds of knowledge everywhere. Modern science is still puzzling through polyvagal theory. It's still puzzling through the gendered differences in stress responses and the psychology of indigenous healing practices. So these other kinds of humanities-based knowledge are not meant to supplant modern medical science. Instead, they are there to point out the imaginative directions that modern medical science can't pursue because of the limitations of its structural methodologies.